Welcome to the Dr. JJ Thomas Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Dr. JJ Thomas Podcast. I'm JJ Thomas. Happy to have you here today. We have another great episode for you. This particular episode, all of our episodes are intended to give you guys information and education and tools and skills to help you live better, live longer, be able to physically do the things you want to do with high performance and resilience and longevity, essentially. And what we're going to talk about is how and why chairs and sitting, prolonged sitting in particular, are actually killing us. It sounds a little crazy, but when you hear me out throughout this episode, it'll make a whole lot of sense. I think on some level, most people realize and recognize that sitting in chairs all day is just not good for us. Most people know. They're like, oh, my back is killing me. I'm sitting too much at work. I should get up and walk around. Instinctively, it makes sense to people that we are sitting too much. Guess what, guys? You are 100% correct, and the research shows it. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to break down all of the research and data that gives you information on number one, why and how it's making us weaker and less resilient and actually decreasing our survivability rate, but also the science behind why and how prolonged sitting is actually changing our bodies in a way that is making us at higher risk for more increased mortality rates, essentially. So what does the research say? Time and time again, research is showing that prolonged sitting is highly correlated with increased cardiovascular disease, increased metabolic diseases, and an increased mortality rate. So risk of mortality, of all-cause mortality, when they look at the data of people who sit for long periods. Essentially, people who sit greater than 9.5 hours a day is the usual norm for a sedentary lifestyle. How can that be, right? How can something, if you think about, as we do with all primal stuff, we think about evolutionary history and evolutionary meaning and consequences behind the way our bodies are intended to move and to live and to function from a survival standpoint. And, if you think about survival and natural selection, you might be tempted to say, well, there could be some value to resting, right? Resting will give us lower metabolic cost, right? We will have a less need for high energy expenditure. So there should be some value in rest, and there is value in rest. But I think what the research is showing, and we're gonna share with you today, is that the way we rest is very important into how our bodies are going to take that rest and be able to do something with it or not. So let's step into that. Let's go back to those primal principles, and let's think about, let's go back to, if you missed this last couple episodes, the last couple episodes we've been spending a lot more time really breaking down what we mean when we say the primal method. And I'll review for those of you that might have missed that episode, but it might be worth it to go back and check it if you guys did miss it, because there's a lot of great information in there. Essentially, a critical piece that you must understand about evolutionary history as it relates to our bodies and our body's efficiency is remembering the point that our bodies were evolutionarily designed to protect ourselves, essentially for survival. If you remember from that last lecture, our musculoskeletal system in particular is an armor for our bodies. And that armor serves to, number one, protect our organ systems, stomach, brain, spinal cord, lungs, heart, all the organ systems, but also serve to support the functions of those organ systems through pressure regulation of the abdominal slings and through fluid dynamics. So I went into that in detail. We're not going to go into it again, but it's important that you have that foundational understanding and presence in today's lecture, because we're going to talk about why sitting for long periods, especially in chairs, messes that whole thing up for us, and how the consequences of that are what's directly related to the increased cardiovascular disease, increased metabolic disease, and increased mortality risk in people who live a sedentary lifestyle. So let's look more into the data. Okay, so let's talk specifics. Let's look at some specific research related to these claims that sitting is actually killing us. Ekelund and his group in 2019 was published in the British Medical Journal. And what they did is they took accelerometer data measuring activity and inactivity levels in individuals. And in the individuals who were sedentary or inactive for greater than 9.5 hours a day, they found there was a significant correlation into an increased mortality risk in those individuals. In addition, Dunstan and their group in 2011 found a distinct correlation between prolonged sitting and increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, how do these things correlate, right? Like, what is it about sitting long periods that makes us predisposed to higher rates of morbidity and higher cardiovascular disease risk? Hamilton and their group in 2017 looked at certain measures of physiologic metrics of the body during periods of inactivity. And what they found was that during these periods of inactivity, the body required less fuel for energy. As a result of this, there was a significant reduction in the production of the enzymes that hydrolyze lipids or fats. The effect being that there was a higher concentration of circulating triglycerides and cholesterol in the body in these inactive individuals. So during a period of inactivity, because of this reduction in these enzymes to break down the lipids, there's more free circulating triglycerides and cholesterol, which puts people at higher risk for cardiovascular disease. Boom, mind-breaking, right? So the science is there. When we're sedentary too long, besides the consequences that it has on our muscles and our bones and our joints and our tendons, on a metabolic, on a physiological level, we're actually putting ourselves at increased risks, and as Hamilton's groups showed, it was directly correlated to cardiovascular risk. So in our evolutionary history, which, as you know, is part of the primal method, like recognizing how our bodies were developed over time from a survivability standpoint is very important. So if we look at that and we ask ourselves, truly, is there not value in rest? Of course there's value in rest, right? Metabolically, we need rest to recover. And Dr. Reichland and his group from University of Southern California, they had these same questions. And so Dr. Reichland, he's an evolutionary biologist, and he does some amazing, incredible work studying things related to the human body and our physiological function. And he has a really unique and cool way of tying it to evolutionary biology. So when Dr. Reichland had this question about rest and its value in terms of our survivability as a species, is, with all this data that shows that sedentary living, sitting in chairs, prolonged sitting too much, causes all these detrimental effects that essentially risk our longevity. They hurt our survivability. He asked himself the same thing we just talked about. Is this something that has consequences, and what did they do in evolutionary history? And so the creative way he decided to study this was he found a culture, a group, a community in Tanzania, which is a group of hunters and gatherers. And these hunters and gatherers, they're not industrialized the way we are industrialized today, right? They're not using chairs. They're living more closely in a life more closely resembling what we did in evolutionary history. And so one of the first studies he did with this group, this hunter and gathering group, is he wanted to understand better how they took rest, how they rested throughout the day, and how often they rested throughout the day, to see if there was a difference between the way hunter and gathering communities rest and the way we rest here in the industrialized societies. What was very interesting, what he found that their rest time, their sedentary time, inactive time as they call it, and essentially non-ambulatory time, was actually correlative to what we do here in the industrialized societies in the US and in other countries that are more industrialized. Their average time, so in the US, our average sedentary time is somewhere between 9 and 9.5 hours. In this group in Tanzania, their average sedentary time was actually 9.8. So it's not that they didn't have sedentary time. Interestingly enough, they also had very highly correlative transitional time. So the number of times that they transition from one sedentary position to another, or from sedentary to non-sedentary. That number correlated to our numbers as well. And even the amount of time that they spent in one prolonged posture also correlated to our society. Here's the crazy thing though. In this study, he also analyzed biomarkers in the blood that show whether or not someone has increased cardiovascular disease risk. In this Tanzania group, in the group of hunters and gatherers, they had relatively no biomarkers putting them at risk for cardiovascular disease. How can that be when our sedentary population, with all the other studies done, show increased cardiovascular disease risk and increased mortality risk related to very similar sedentary numbers? So Dr. Rachel and his group started wondering, well, maybe it's the way that that the group, the hunters and gatherers, are posturing when they're resting. Maybe it's that they're not sitting in these chairs, but they're choosing other postures. Maybe that's why the muscle activity level is different, and that could help explain why they're not having these negative consequences from, quote, inactivity. So they did another study. They looked at, Rachel and his group did another study where this time they analyzed the different types of sedentary postures that these hunters and gatherers participated in when they were inactive. What they found is that in this group in Tanzania, when they rested, they spent about 18% of the time in a squat. Some of that was unsupported, some of that was supported, but in a deep squat. 12.5% of the time of sedentary time, they were in a kneeling position. And about 50% of the time, they were just in a ground sit, either cross-legged, sometimes in a long sit, but again, not really in a chair-like position. They took it a step further and they measured muscle activity in these postures. So they had accelerometer driven data and EMG activation of the lower leg muscles essentially. And what they found is, especially as you'd expect in the squat patterns and in the kneeling positions, there was a significantly higher muscle activation of the soleus, the anterior tibialis, and the vastus lateralis. Of course there would be, right? Because in sitting in a chair, we're completely, inactive. Our muscles don't have to be engaged. They don't have to be present. In a squat position or in a kneeling position, those muscles are active. Now, what I want you to do is pause for a minute. Imagine what we're talking about here. We're talking about muscle activation in resting postures, but non-chair resting postures, so this squat and this kneeling position. And now I want you to take that and piggyback that concept with what we spoke about in the last episode and in this episode regarding the importance of our bodies working as a system, and the high level of importance of our musculoskeletal system in particular, and how our musculoskeletal system drives that organ support, but also that fluid dynamic and pressure regulation systems. So if you consider that, then you can recognize potentially the high value that maintaining a squat position, I don't know if you guys see me, a squat position supported or unsupported, doing work down here, resting, however you are. Sometimes I find my kids used to be embarrassed by it, but they're not anymore. At like wrestling matches and tournaments, I'll sit against the bleachers like this. Like I'll squat and just support my back like this. Because now, I usually have to come back a little bit, because now I'm deep in a squat and I'm giving input from my muscles. It's a low level of activation, but it's a higher level of activation than if I'm just sitting in a chair. I know a lot of the PTs have heard, and maybe some of you of the general population out there have heard the description of the soleus muscle as the second heart. Dr. Janet Travell of Travell and Simon's book is the one that kind of coined that phrase. And the soleus is called the second heart mainly because it has such a very important critical role in supporting the vascular return of blood flow back up to the heart. That muscle activity is really important for cardiovascular function, and Dr. Janet Travell, way back in the 70s, knew that. This correlates directly to our chair-sitting dilemma, right? this Tanzanian culture, these hunter and gatherers, they're resting in non-chair postures, and they're capitalizing on our body's brilliant design and capitalizing on that low level but higher muscle activity than chairs, and using that muscle activation to flush our system so that all the systems are working interdependently and they're allowing the reliance on each other to function as a system the way we were evolutionarily intended to. So circling back to Dr. Raislin's research and data, he reviewed the data that he looked at through their research and also other information from other research sources. And what they talked about in the discussion is the fact that in industrialized societies, the lower muscle activation that we see in the lower extremity muscles causes these detrimental effects. It causes a reduction in lipid and glucose metabolism, which is going to affect everything from inflammation in our bodies to cellular repair mechanisms. Those detrimental effects end up cascading into problems with everything from cellular repair to our blood flow and our endothelial mechanisms, or how our endothelial cells repair. If you remember from that last episode, all of our cells are repairing every day. Many billions and billions of cells are repairing, but if we're not supporting that repair through utilizing even low level of muscle activation strategies, then we're missing out on key components of our health for survivability. So, moral of the story is we got to ditch the chairs a little bit, you guys. We've got to move more frequently. We've got to find a way to have the guts, essentially, to not conform to society and always sit in these chairs and bleachers. I mean, bleachers, I should have named this, bleachers are the death of people, because bleachers are the most uncomfortable things, and this is exactly why. They do not allow the blood flow and the muscle activation that we need to support our body's intended function. So we've got to have the guts, essentially, to break the norms of society and not always sit in the chair when it's there for us, okay? If you have the ability, now, I recognize not everyone can get into a deep squat like I did. Work up to it. Work with your physical therapist so that you can earn that position again. Kneel when you can. Lie on your belly and work when you can. Change positions so that you're not just inactive in a chair. It will literally save your life. That does bring up one more point. I was about to wrap up, but I do want to talk about one other piece that the research I reviewed for this particular episode showed, which I think was pretty profound. A lot of the research, well, let's talk first about health norms and recommendations in the United States related to physical activity. The health guidelines for the United States in terms of physical activity, they want individuals to accumulate 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity every week. You could essentially, and they don't break it down how many minutes during each day, but they say essentially accumulate 150 minutes in 7 days. That essentially equates to 30 minutes, 5 days a week. So that's the recommended level, which if you really think about that, that's 1/48 of your day. 1/48 of your day achieving moderate to vigorous physical activity is our recommendation in the US. That's really not enough, especially when we look at the data we just saw related to sedentary lifestyle and the consequences of sitting 9 hours a day does to us. What's even more remarkable, though, about this recommendation is that many studies also looked at sedentary living, so anyone sitting greater than 9.5 hours a day, and they analyzed the data of these individuals, including, so they adjusted for how much moderate to vigorous physical activity they did as well. And the disappointing fact that they found is that regardless of how much they were exercising in a moderate to vigorous sense, if they sat for 9 hours or greater, they still had all those negative detriments. They still had increased cardiovascular disease risk, they still had increased metabolic disease risk, and they still had decreased survivability or increase in all-cause mortality risk. So guess what, guys? If you're getting out there, good for you. You're getting your heart rate up 30 minutes or 45 minutes or an hour, 5 days a week, yay, don't stop. But that doesn't mean that you're not going to have the negative consequences of sitting. If you're still sitting 9 hours a day, you're still having all of that time inactive where your metabolic energy demand is going down, and the consequence to that, the response of that from the body, is to change the way you're metabolizing the lipids and the parts of your body you need to break down so you can function efficiently. So I don't want to discourage you from exercising. God knows we all need it, and I want you to get that heart rate up. But I just want to point out that even if you're a religious hour-a-day exerciser, you still can't go sit 9 hours a day. You got to get up. You got to squat. You got to try to find other positions that will put you more in that hunter-gatherer society type activity levels and decrease your risk of mortality. The last thing I'll say about this last piece is if you imagine what I'm suggesting here from this hunter and gatherer society in terms of resting positions, those resting positions we talked about correlate directly to what we describe as our primal patterns, right? Primal patterns essentially are those patterns, those archetypal postures, or those evolutionary postures that we found in hunter-gatherer days where they're working in this squat position, right? They're maybe they're here, maybe they're doing, this is called like cowboy posture. So I'll move around in all these different archetypal postures when I'm watching my boys wrestle. But not only are these archetypal postures, they also correlate to the developmental postures, which is where the name primal comes from to begin with. So remember, earning the right to run, walk, and jump comes through these developmental sequences. Those developmental sequences are literally images, mirror images of these archetypal postures that the hunter and gatherer societies are adopting that make them so much more resilient in terms of cardiovascular health and survivability. So when we talk at Primal Physical Therapy and Primal University and in the Primal Method about using these postures, using these developmental patterns, what we're really saying is that we're suggesting that you honor your evolutionary history and design and support your musculoskeletal system, that really strong, brilliantly engineered armor that you have, in a way that our body deserves and demands. And that's how you're going to live longer, feel better, and conquer the world. So hope you enjoyed this. I love this stuff. I get passionate about it, could talk about it forever. So if anybody wants to chit chat a little bit, love to do it. So reach out, subscribe so you don't miss more content, and we'll talk soon.